The bass thumped through the nightclub lights, flashing in hypnotic patterns across a sea of swaying bodies. Billy Cruz 27 stood behind her turntables, lost in the rhythm, her fingers dancing over the controls. Then it happened. 3 drunk regulars pushed their way to the front, jeering. In a blur, one yanked at her top, tearing it down over her shoulder. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some laughing, others staring. The humiliation burned through her like fire. Her mind went numb for a second, caught between shock and disbelief. Riley had worked for years to earn this spot at the hottest club downtown. Friday nights belonged to her. This was supposed to be her escape, her moment of power. But now, in front of hundreds of eyes, these guys had turned her into a spectacle. She could still feel the sting of their touch, the echo of their mocking voices. The security guards, stationed near the entrance, didn't move. She could see them looking, hesitating, their expression somewhere between annoyance and apathy. Her blood boiled hotter. She wasn't about to let this slide, not here, not tonight. Her eyes locked on the ringleader, a bulky man in his late 20s with a beer sloshing in one hand, grinning as if he just pulled the funniest prank of his life. His 2 friends flanked him, smaller but equally smug. They didn't see Riley's jaw tighten, didn't notice the way her hands curled into fists, because Riley Cruz wasn't just a DJ. Before she ever stepped behind a mixer, she'd spent years in a dingy boxing gym learning how to plant her feet, throw a jab, take a hit. Music was her passion, but fighting that was survival. And right now, the survival part of her was waking up. She pulled her shoulder strap back into place with slow, deliberate control, her eyes never leaving theirs. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She let the music carry on as if nothing had happened. But inside, she was calculating, watching their movements, waiting for the right moment to hit back. She wasn't going to let them humiliate her and walk away with the story. No, tonight, they'd learn a story they'd never forget. The set carried on, but Riley's focus wasn't on the beats anymore. Every bass drop was a countdown. Every flashing strobe light, a reminder of the 3 figures lingering near the dance floor, drinking and laughing. Her humiliation hadn't cooled, it had crystallized into something sharper. She could feel the crowd's shifting energy. Some had gone back to dancing, but others still whispered and pointed. Each glance was a knife twisting deeper. Riley's hand stayed steady on the mixer, but her mind played back every second of the attack. His hand grabbing her top, the cheers from his buddies, the ripple of laughter. She scanned the room. The bouncers stayed planted by the door, either unwilling or too lazy to confront the situation. That was fine. She didn't need them. If she'd learned anything from her years in the gym, it was that you only relied on yourself when things got real. A flicker of memory flashed Coach Manny's voice, echoing in the damp air of the boxing gym. You don't need to be the biggest in the room. You just need to be the one they regret messing with. The ringleader was now leaning against a table, beer half spilled, telling a story with big sloppy gestures, probably bragging about what he'd just done. One of his friends scanned the dance floor, eyeing women with that same predatory smirk. The third looked like he was barely standing. Riley's fingers tightened around her headphones. She could take them all, she knew it. But the timing had to be perfect. If she rushed it, she'd look reckless. If she waited too long, she'd look scared. The moment needed to land like a beat drop, sharp, loud, and impossible to ignore. She switched tracks, letting the song ride on autopilot for a moment, then stepped away from the booth. The club's floor vibrated under her boots as she walked, weaving through the moving crowd. She didn't look at them yet. She approached from the side, letting their laughter cover her footsteps. The smell of beer and sweat hit her as she got close. Her heart thudded in rhythm with the bass, but her breathing stayed even. She could almost hear Coach Manny again. Breathe before you hit. Aim before you throw. The ringleader finally noticed her. His grin widened, dripping with mockery. Well, look who he started, but he didn't finish, because, in Riley's mind, the decision was already made. Tonight, she wasn't just a DJ. She was about to remind this entire club that she was no one's victim. The ringleader's words died in his throat as Riley's right fist came up fast and clean, snapping forward with perfect form. The knuckles landed square on his jaw, hard enough to make the beer in his hand explode across the floor as his head snapped sideways. Gasps and shouts tore through the music-hazed crowd, the bass line suddenly irrelevant against the shockwave of the moment. The man stumbled back 2 steps, grabbing at the table for balance, eyes wide with disbelief. He'd expected fear, maybe even tears. What he got instead was a punch that came from years of discipline, delivered without hesitation. "Whoa!" "What the hell?" one of his friends yelled, but Riley's gaze cut to him so sharply, he froze. She didn't speak, just stepped closer, planting her boots in a solid fighting stance. Her shoulders were square, her chin tucked, her fists ready. The crowd had shifted now, the space around them widening as clubgoers pulled out their phones recording. The same people who'd smirked at her humiliation minutes ago were suddenly holding their breath, waiting to see what she'd do next. The ringleader spat blood onto the floor, his shock giving way to anger. "You think you can—" He started stepping toward her, but Riley didn't wait. A quick shuffle step forward, a left hook straight to the ribs. He folded the air, rushing out of him in a grunt. The second bully lunged, grabbing for her arm. Wrong move. Riley pivoted, catching his wrist and twisting it hard, spinning him off balance. A knee drove into his stomach, forcing him to drop to the floor with a wheeze. The crowd roared now, the club's energy transforming from tense to electric. The third man hesitated, his drunken brain clearly weighing whether joining in was worth it. Riley took a single step toward him, her eyes locking onto his. That was all it took. He backed up with his hands raised, muttering something about not wanting trouble. Security finally moved in, but it wasn't to save her. It was to scoop up the writhing mess she'd left on the floor. The ringleader was still clutching his side, glaring up at her through the sweat and humiliation. She didn't need to say a word. The look she gave him said it all. "You picked the wrong target." The DJ booth light was still pulsing in the corner of her eye. Riley turned and walked back toward it, the crowd parting for her, like she was royalty returning to her throne. And when she dropped the next beat, the place erupted, not for the music, but for the woman who'd just turned her own public humiliation into the most talked about moment of the night. Riley's hand slid back over the turntables. But the energy wasn't the same. It was bigger, heavier, pulsing, with the adrenaline still rushing through her veins. Every bass line felt sharper, every drop louder, as if the club itself was feeding off what had just happened. She didn't even have to look up to know people were still watching her eyes. Wide phones still held high. Out of the corner of her vision, she saw the 3 men being hauled toward the exit. The ringleader twisted in the bouncer's grip, shouting slurred insults, but each word was drowned by the music and the crowd's jeers. His friends stumbled behind him, one still clutching his stomach, the other avoiding eye contact with anyone. Riley kept the mix smooth, but inside, her focus lingered on their faces, the exact look she'd wanted. Not smugness, not even anger, but shame. She'd taken the moment they tried to own and flipped it on them in front of everyone. They hadn't just lost a fight. They'd lost the crowd. Her friend, Mariah, the club's bartender, slipped up beside the booth during a slower track. "Holy hell, Riles," she whispered over the music. "You just went viral. I swear half the place recorded that." Riley smirked faintly, but didn't let her guard down yet. She scanned the room. Some people were dancing again, others still buzzing in tight circles, retelling the story as if they'd been front row. A few guys were looking at her differently now, not with that casual, dismissive glance they gave most women in a DJ booth, but with something closer to respect. She didn't do it for their approval. She did it because letting those men walk away without consequence would have been worse than the humiliation itself. But seeing the shift in the air, feeling it, it told her she'd done more than just defend herself. She'd changed the tone of the night. The next track hit, and the dance floor surged again. Riley rode the wave, letting the music swell and crash her movements calm but deliberate. The confidence that had always been there buried under the need to keep the peace was now fully exposed. The club's manager made his way over between songs. "You good?" he asked, his tone a mix of concern and awe. "I'm fine," Riley said, her voice even. "Better than fine." He gave a slow nod, the kind that said he knew better than to push further. "Guess I don't need to tell security to keep a closer eye anymore." "Guess not," she replied, already queuing up the next beat. By the time the night was winding down, Riley had the room back in her control completely. People weren't whispering about the strip anymore. They were talking about the punch. And as far as she was concerned, that was the only part of the story that mattered. The last track of the night faded into silence, and the lights in the club began to brighten. The crowd, still buzzing, started to drift toward the exits. Conversations overlapping in a jumble of excitement. Riley stepped down from the booth, her heartbeat finally beginning to slow, but her body still carried the weight of adrenaline. Mariah was waiting by the bar with 2 bottles of water. "You were a damn superhero tonight," she said, handing one over. "Those guys are going to be famous for all the wrong reasons." Riley took a long drink, the cold water cutting through the dryness in her throat. "Let 'em be," she said. "They wanted attention. They got it." Across the room, a few club regulars gave her nods of acknowledgement, the kind reserved for someone who had just earned a new kind of respect. Even some of the women she didn't know smiled at her, like they understood exactly what it had taken for her to fight back. Security came by one of the bouncers looking sheepish. "Should have stepped in sooner," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah," Riley said flatly, "you should have." She didn't raise her voice, but the weight in her tone made him nod without another word. As she gathered her gear, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A flood of notifications lit up the screen. Videos from the crowd had already hit social media. One clip showed her punch in slow motion, the crowd exploding in cheers afterward. Another had captions, "Don't mess with DJ Cruz." Views were climbing fast. Mariah peered over her shoulder. "That's going to be everywhere by morning." Riley thought about it for a moment. She hadn't asked to be a viral story, but maybe this wasn't a bad thing. If even one person saw that video and remembered that they didn't have to freeze when someone crossed the line, that they could push back, then it would be worth it. She slung her bag over her shoulder and stepped outside into the cool night air. The city was quieter out here, but her mind was still replaying the scene in flashes, the moment of humiliation, the decision to act, the feel of her fist connecting. The club door shut behind her, muffling the bass. Riley Cruz walked away without looking back. The night had started with someone trying to strip away her dignity in front of a crowd, but it ended with her standing taller than ever. Her power reclaimed, her name now whispered with a mix of respect and awe. Some fights, she thought, weren't about winning or losing. They were about making sure the world knew you'd never bow your head. Riley's night was a reminder that humiliation doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the spark that lights the fight back. Standing up for yourself isn't always easy, and it's rarely convenient, but letting others decide your worth is far more costly. The world is full of moments where silence feels safer, but real change happens when you choose to act. Riley didn't just protect herself, she reclaimed the narrative in front of everyone. And that's the lesson: never let anyone strip away your dignity. If they try, make sure they remember the cost of crossing you.